G'day, this is Chris Savage from Our Real Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the life of the Messiah from a Jewish perspective. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Thank you for coming back again. We're looking at paragraphs 89 to 95. Last session, we saw Peter's confession. Peter's confession was, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And with that confession, Peter was given certain things were said about Peter. One of the things that we saw in last session was that he was given the keys of the kingdom. Remember, the keys of the kingdom are the keys that open the doors to the church. And Peter opened the door of the church. We see in Acts chapter 2, he opened the door to the Jews. In Acts chapter 8, he opened the door to the Samaritans. And in Acts chapter 9, to the Gentiles. Now, once that door is open, it remains open. He was also given, in the first instance, he was given the authority to bind and loose. It was given to Peter only at this point. Later on, after the death of Jesus, all the other apostles will have this authority as well. And in the context that it was given, it had to do with the establishment of the church, and the issue is apostolic authority. Remember, to bind is to forbid something, and to loose is to allow something. And in the epistles, we see the apostles. In the epistles, we see the apostles binding and loosing. What are they doing? They're permitting things which were formerly forbidden, and then they're also forbidding things which were formerly permitted. Jesus begins to spell out his program of death and resurrection, and we see that Peter, who had this magnificent testimony before about who Jesus was, rebukes Jesus, and he physically was restraining Jesus, manhandles Jesus to say, you will never die. You'll never die. That's not going to happen to you. And Jesus responds to him. He says, get you behind me, Satan. Why? Because at this point in time, Peter was being influenced by Satan to try and keep Jesus from the cross. Now, we saw 3 lessons in discipleship last session. We saw that a person must be willing to identify fully with the rejection of Jesus. And remember that rejection brought a lot of shame. Being crucified brings a lot of shame upon your family, and your family members, and it brings a lot of shame upon the individual as well. So we need to be able to be fully identified with Jesus in that rejection that he experienced. And Jesus tells us that if his disciples tried to avoid rejection and death by not taking up their crosses, they would actually fail. Why? Because they would still be there when the AD 70 judgment would take place, and they would actually lose their lives. By failing to take up their cross and follow Jesus, they would lose their lives in that judgment. Now, to those who took up their cross, Jesus promised eternal life. We saw that Jesus was transfigured on Mount Hermon. We saw 3 apostles who saw that, and they saw him as he will be at his second coming, which is in his glorified state. We saw the Shekinah glory of Jesus when he virtually peeled back his humanity, and kaboom, the Shekinah glory just poured forth. And also with him, we saw 2 men. We saw Moses and Elijah. And Peter, in his rashness, I guess, but also in his fear, he says, we'll make 3 tabernacles. Why? It was a normal response for what he knew. He knew that the Feast of Tabernacles was what was going to bring in the Messianic kingdom. And so, he sees the glory of Jesus. He sees these Elijah and Moses, and he says, okay, the kingdom is coming. Problem is that he did not understand the program of 2 comings. He comes first time to Israel. He comes second time to be the judge and the king. We saw the Shekinah glory. It overshadows them all. And then we had this bat call, this voice out of heaven saying, this is my beloved son, hear him, virtually saying, you've already heard Elijah and Moses and the law and the prophets. Now, this is the one who you now listen to, and it is my son, Jesus. So what we see here is that This actually authenticated the Messiahship of Jesus, this transfiguration, and it anticipates that there's going to be a future earthly kingdom, and it also guarantees fulfillment of all Scripture. And what we see is that we also see in that instance of the transfiguration that we know that there's life beyond the grave, because we saw two people there. We saw one, Moses, and we saw Elijah. Now, what we also saw at that time was actually we see Jesus's love for us, and it demonstrated to us what it cost him to come to earth, because twice now he had to veil his glory at his incarnation, and then at that transfiguration time where he veiled it again. So this week, this session now, we come into instruction concerning Elijah, and this we find in Matthew chapter 17 verse 9 to 13, Mark 9 to 13, and Luke chapter 9 verse 36. Now we need to see the tie-in between John the Baptist and Elijah the prophet, and we're going to see it as we go through this section. Now remember that before John was even born, remember we had the angel Gabriel had declared that John was going to come in the spirit and the power of Elijah. If you had it right back into Luke chapter 1 verse 17, you would see that where that declaration was made. Now, there are a couple of things we need to see about John the Baptist. When John was asked if he was Elijah, he says, no, he said, I'm not Elijah, I'm John the Baptist. And we see that back in John chapter 1, verse 21. However, we know that John did come in the spirit and the power of Elijah. So he came the same as Elijah, if you like. And because Gabriel, the angel Gabriel told John's father, it is he, in Luke 1:17, he says, it is he who will go as a forerunner before him in the spirit and the power of Elijah. Before him, he goes in the spirit and power before who is a forerunner? Before Jesus, before the Messiah. And in the verses that we're going to have a look at here, Jesus stated here that after the kingdom offer had been accepted, if the kingdom offer had been accepted, then John would actually have fulfilled Elijah's role. And Elijah, remember, his purpose is to restore all things. Is to bring back the family unit, the Jewish family unit, back together again. And we see that in Matthew 17 verse 11 and Mark 9 verse 12. Problem is that Jesus was rejected. Therefore, John the Baptist, or John the Baptizer, couldn't fill Elijah's role. And so what we're going to see is that in the future, Elijah, he must come back and he must do this. Now, Jesus and his three disciples, they're now heading down from the top of Mount Hebron. They're going down, and Jesus tells them, he says, listen, don't tell nobody the vision that you saw. Tell the vision after the Son of Man is risen from the dead. And we see that in Matthew 17 verse 9. And they obviously obeyed that, because we see that in Luke 9:36. However, they understood the bit about not telling anybody about the transfiguration, but they didn't get the bit about when he says rising from the dead again, rising again from the dead. And they kept saying or questioning amongst themselves, what's he talking about? What's he talking about rising from the dead? We'll see that in Mark 9 verse 10. Why were they asking this question? Because it shows that they still don't understand his program of death and resurrection. He's already told them about it, but they don't get it. They don't get his death and resurrection, nor do they get the fact that there's going to be two comings. And this caused them to raise a question, because it says in Mark chapter 9 verse 11, it says, and they asked him, saying, how is it then that the scribes say that Elijah must first come? Well, that's a valid question, because we know that the scribes and the Pharisees had correctly worked out, interpreted from Malachi chapter 4, verse 5 to 6, that the prophet Elijah is going to be the forerunner of the Messiah, and he must come first. But the promise of Malachi was that Elijah would appear before the second coming. It says before the day of the Lord in Malachi. It did not promise that Elijah would come before the first coming. In fact, if you were to look in Malachi chapter 3, verse 1, the prophet Malachi did say that there would be an unnamed forerunner would actually herald in the first coming of the Messiah. In Malachi 3, verse 1, it says, "Behold, I send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom ye seek will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant whom you desire, behold, he comes, says Jehovah of hosts." So what this tells us is, in Malachi 3:1, is that this unnamed forerunner is going to come and prepare the way for the Messiah. And the Messiah is going to suddenly come to his temple, and this Messiah will be the messenger of the covenant. Which covenant? The new covenant. But then in Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 to 6, the prophet then said that Elijah would come before the second coming. "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and terrible day of Jehovah come." That's the tribulation. "And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse." So the question that they asked in Mark 9:11, how is it that the scribes say Elijah must first come? That originated from the fact here that the apostles simply don't understand the program of Messiah's two comings. And Jesus affirmed that what the scribes taught was correct. And he said unto them, "Elijah indeed comes first and restores all things." And we see that in Mark chapter 9, verse 12. Elijah will come first and restore all things. However, he comes first in keeping with Malachi's prophecy. He precedes Jesus's second coming, not his first. So Jesus then added, "Well, how is it written of the Son of Man that he should suffer many things and be set at naught?" And that's in Mark chapter 9, verse 12 as well. In other words, what he's saying is that if Elijah came before the first coming and did the work of restoration, it would mean then that the prophecies about Messiah's suffering would not be fulfilled. And virtually that would mean that Messiah wasn't Messiah, that Jesus was Messiah. So what we see is the order of events is this. Messiah comes the first time to suffer many things and be set at naught, at nothing. Sometime later, Elijah will arrive to then restore all things. And this precedes the second coming of the Messiah, at which time Jesus will set up his kingdom. And in Mark's gospel, he added here, "But I say unto you that Elijah is come, and they have also done unto him whatsoever they would, even as it is written of him." That's Mark 9:13. And then Matthew added a little bit more to this to bring some more clarity to this. He said, "Then understood the disciples that he spoke unto them of John the Baptist." And that's in Matthew 17, verse 13. Bang these two statements together, we then can conclude that Jesus was saying there is a sense in which Elijah has already come. He came by his type, and which John the Baptist was a type of Elijah. Now we have to just remember that Malachi, the prophet Malachi, he already promised that there'd be two forerunners, not one. So John was a type of Elijah by preparing the way of the Lord before his first coming, when he came to suffer and die. And then the baptizer came in the spirit and the power of the prophet, though he denied actually that he was Elijah. He says, "No, I'm not Elijah." Elijah himself will come in future times and he will restore all things. But this restoration precedes, it's before, and is in preparation for the second coming. So sometime in the future, Elijah will bodily return to this earth to restore father to son, son to father in the Jewish household. So what we see here is that the Son must suffer and die before the final restoration, before Elijah comes the second time. So for the second coming. So John was Elijah in a type. He was the forerunner of the Messiah when he came to suffer and die. All right, so that's John the Baptist and Elijah. Now we're going to look at Jesus's instruction. Remember, this whole section we're looking in is Jesus training the 12 apostles to take over the role when he's gone. And then we see in Matthew 17, 14 to 20, Mark 9, 14 to 29, and Luke 9, 37 to 43, we see instruction here concerning faith. So the four men, which are the three who saw his transfiguration and Jesus, returned to where the other apostles had remained, and he finds them. There's a bit of a stoush going, a bit of a dispute going on. Now, what's the dispute all about? We find this in Mark chapter 9, verse 14. And when they came to the disciples, they saw a great multitude about them and scribes questioning with them. So some of the scribes were now questioning the other 9 apostles who were down back in the ground. And there was a dispute being stirred up here. Why? Because the apostles had failed to cast out a demon from a boy. And the scribes, well, these guys are disciples of Jesus. If they can't do this, they were using their failure to cast this demon out to negate Jesus's messiahship. And in fact, this demon was violent. And the boy's father explained he is epileptic and suffers grievously, for oftentimes he falls into the fire and oftentimes into the water. So this is in Matthew chapter 17, verse 15. And Luke added here that a spirit takes him and he suddenly cries out, and it tears him that he foams, and it hardly departs from him, bruising him sorely. So this young fella is in a great deal of agony here. And we see that in Luke 9, verse 39. So this is an extreme case of demonic control here, which included epilepsy and suicidal tendencies. Now, despite their experiences in exorcisms, the disciples, they couldn't cast this one out. So the crowd are being stirred up, and the scribes are saying, well, obviously your master is nobody. Now, Jesus now comes along and he emphasized something about that generation. And he says, "O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you?" And we see this in Mark 9, verse 19. And then he said to the father, he says, bring here your son. And that's Luke 9:41. And they brought him unto him. Meaning they brought the son away from the crowds to where Jesus is. The demon now makes one last go to cause pain, and straight away it says the spirit tear him grievously, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming. We see that in Mark chapter 9, verse 20. And Luke also added his bit here. He says in Luke 9:42, he says, "And as he was yet a coming, the demon dashed him down and tear him grievously." Now, by this time, Jesus performed miracles. Remember, he performs miracles on 2 grounds now. He doesn't just do it for anybody anymore. There needs to be a personal need. So somebody has to have a personal need, and it has to be also on the basis of faith. Now, we see both elements here in this occasion. Why? Because Jesus asked the boy's father, how long time is it since this has come onto him? We see that in Mark 9:21. And he answered, from a child. Now, this condition was prolonged. The demon had attempted to kill the child previously, sometimes by casting him into the fire, sometimes into the water to try and drown him. We see that back in Mark 9:22. And then the father now expresses his personal need. He virtually says, Jesus, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. We need your help. So there's personal need. But the phrase, if you can, was not a confession of faith. But there's a bit of a doubt there. if you can do it, Jesus, can you please help us? That doubt had to be removed before Jesus could perform the miracle. So Jesus responded, if you can, all things are possible to him that believes. And this is in Mark 9:23. The father, straight away, he got it. He says, hang on. The father of the child cried out and he says, I believe, help you mine unbelief. And so what we see here is he now exercises faith. He no longer says, if you can, he says, I believe you can do this, Jesus. And so Jesus, he had removed the father and his son away from the multitude, and he quickly cast the demon out. Why? Because he now sees the multitude running towards them. Remember, miracles were no longer for the benefit of the masses. They're all private. From that time back in Matthew chapter 12, where he was rejected, all the miracles are now private. All the healings are now private. It's no longer for the masses. And it's all on these two bases, personal need and personal faith. Now, the demon was exorcised pretty painfully. We see that in Mark 9:26-27. Although the miracle wasn't intended for the masses, they could not fail to see the result, because it says they were all, this is in Luke 9:43. It says they were all astonished at the majesty of God. All astonished at the majesty of God. Now, poor old disciples now, what about them? They failed to cast this thing out. They're a bit, what about us, Jesus? Why couldn't we cast out this demon despite, we've done exorcisms before. How come we couldn't do this one? And remember, he's going to teach me a lesson here. It says, when he was come into the house, his disciples asked him privately, how is it that we couldn't cast it out? Mark 9:28. Now, Jesus gives two reasons. First up, he says, this kind of demon can come out by nothing save by prayer. What he's saying, and that's in Mark 9:29. What he's saying here is that, listen, you used the wrong method, all right? Most commentaries and sermons on this passage focus on the last little bit. It says, save by prayer, and failing to recognize that it is this kind of demon can only come out by prayer. The question is, what kind of demon did Jesus refer? According to Mark 9, verse 17, it says this kind was a dumb demon. So casting out a demon that caused the possessed to become mute or dumb is one of the three miracles that Dr. Fruchtenbaum calls messianic, because of the responses to it. And in this verse, Jesus verified the Pharisaic observation that dumb demons are different. The Pharisees could cast out all kinds of demons, except that they could never, ever cast out a dumb demon that caused muteness. And previously, the disciples had only dealt with demons that they could exorcise in Jesus' name. However, dumb demons had to be prayed out. So that's the first thing. It was this kind of demon. They were using the wrong method. Had to be by prayer, not by commanding it out, because they, for start, they couldn't find the name of the demon because he couldn't talk. Second, it says the apostles lacked faith because Jesus says, second reason, because of your little faith. We see that in Matthew 17, verse 20. When the normal procedure failed, what they should have done was they should have went straight to prayer. This is not working. Let's get and ask the Lord what are we doing wrong? And so what we see here is that the method was wrong, and so now it revealed their lack of faith. Jesus applied the lesson here to the disciples. If you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, which is only a tiny seed, you shall say unto this mountain, remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you. And we see that in Matthew 17, verse 20. Now, where are they? Remember, they're down the bottom from Mount Hermon here. He's referring to this mountain. If he meant a literal mountain, he was probably referring to Mount Hermon. However, because that's where they just come down from. But if we look at the immediate context here, what's it about? There was a bit of a stoush here between the satanic world and Jesus. So in this context, in the immediate context here, mountain might indicate it's a symbol for either a king or a kingdom or a throne. And that is, we see that right through the scriptures. Jesus had just clashed with the kingdom of Satan. And in the immediate context, this mountain most likely refers to the satanic kingdom. And so faith coupled with the proper method, prayer, would have enabled the apostles to handle the situation. Now we have a further instruction concerning the death of the king, and we see this in Matthew 17, 22 to 23, Mark 9, 30 to 32, and Luke 43 to 45. Now this was Jesus's second announcement of his coming death and resurrection. And it now comes when he was teaching his apostles alone. It says they went forth from thence, passed through Galilee, and he would not that any man should know it, for he taught his disciples. And we see that in Mark chapter 9, verse 30 to 31. Now, Jesus intended this to be a training time for his disciples. And he says, so he says, let these words, he says to them, listen, guys, let these words sink into your ears. For the Son of Man shall be delivered up into the hands of men. And that's Luke 9, verse 44. And this is the second time he's told them this. And they still don't understand. They were exceeding sorry, according to Matthew 17, 23. Why? Because it says they understood not the saying and they were afraid to ask him. We see that in Mark 9, 32. See, while we're going to look at all these different passages of the one incident, we get everybody is reporting it in their theme. Now, and Luke also added here, but they understood not this saying, and it was concealed from them, that they should not perceive it, and they were afraid to ask him about this saying. That's Luke 9:45. So what we're going to see is later on, when the crucifixion and the resurrection finally occurred, it's going to take them all by surprise. It was concealed from them, and they were afraid to ask him about the saying. So their being sorry is not because they didn't understand, but because they didn't understand and they were afraid to ask. So again, what we see with these events when they happen, they're going to catch the disciples by surprise. And this continues. Remember that theme of partial sight, partial blindness that we looked at? This is on the part of the disciples. They got partial sight and they're still partially blinded. Now, this instruction concerning sonship, this is all in Matthew 17, 24 to 27. Now, after the incident with the demon that caused the dumbness and Jesus' second announcement of the future events, he and his apostles, they go back to the headquarters in Capernaum. We see that in Matthew 17, 24. So they're back up into Jewish territory again, and therefore they're now under Jewish jurisdiction. We now have the circumstances for the event that was now going to occur. It says here, it says, they that received the half shekel came to Peter and said, does not your teacher pay the half shekel? And we see this in Matthew 17, verse 24. What are they talking about? Well, I'll show you what they're talking about. The half shekel is a temple tax, all right? It was a required offering. We see that right back in the Old Testament in Exodus chapter 30, verses 11 to 16. So what that was that each male in Israel had to pay this half shekel temple tax every year. And the purpose of it is to maintain the tabernacle, or in this case, the temple. So the tax was due around about March, April, around about Passover time. Passover was the first feast of the year. But this incident now takes close to the Feast of Tabernacles, meaning here that Jesus's payment of this tax was around about 6 months late. The tax collectors came and asked Peter, Doesn't your master pay the half shekel? How come he gets away with it? And without check, and this is in Matthew 17:24, and without checking, Peter says, oh, of course he pays, and he let it go at that. Of course he pays. I can't have them accusing my master. Now, Jesus knew what took place, right? And when Peter now comes into the house, he has a special private lesson for Peter. He says, what do you think, Peter? The kings of the earth, from whom do they receive toll or tribute? From their sons or from strangers? And when he said from strangers, Jesus said unto him, therefore the sons are free. And we see that in Matthew 17:25-26. Now, what's Jesus's point here? Well, Jesus's point here is that the Roman citizens, the sons, right? If you're a Roman citizen, you were a son of Rome. They did not pay taxes. And because they did not have to pay taxes, the Roman government had to be financed by tribute or by tolls and taxes collected from these subjugated nations, and they're the strangers. So this procedure was not exclusive to the Roman Empire, because in some countries the citizens had to pay tribute, but the sons of the king were exempt from paying taxes. Now, in Israel, the half shekel was to be paid as a temple tax. And who's Jesus? Jesus is Lord of the temple. So the believers were his sons, and therefore they were exempt from paying the temple tax. And the reason that Jesus did not bother to pay the temple tax 6 months earlier was that as Lord of the temple, he is exempt. And also his apostles, because they're sons of the king, because they're his disciples, they were also, spiritually speaking, they were also exempt from paying this tax, the temple tax. Therefore, Jesus didn't tell them to go and pay it, but now he says, listen, lest we cause them to stumble, in verse 27, Matthew 17, Jesus now ordered Peter to pay this tax. There was no need to cause the religious rulers to stumble, unnecessarily, since this was a Mosaic issue, not a Mishnaic issue. Mosaic issue means it was codified in the Mosaic law. Mishnaic means it's one of those oral traditions. Now, so Jesus has to provide for a miracle here, because he tells Peter to temporarily go back to do some fishing, and when you catch a fish, you're gonna pull out a full shekel in its mouth. That's in verse 27. And this would pay the tax for both Peter and Jesus. And the disciples here now learned that they are the sons of the king, and he is Lord of the temple, and paying the temple tax was not required. But for the sake of avoiding any unnecessary stumbling, they were to pay it anyway. So there were more important concern to be turned into principles. Now we're going to see an instruction concerning humility here. Peter has just had the Lord provide him a half shekel to pay his tax. Now we see this in Matthew 18:1-5, Mark 9:33-37, and Luke 9:46-48. So paragraph 93 and 94 belong together because we're going to see that intertwined. The first one teaches to be childlike, and the second one teaches to receive those who are childlike. And we have the background to the lesson here because there's a bit of a dispute going on amongst the disciples. It says there arose a reasoning among them, which of them was the greatest. That's Luke 9:46. And Matthew gives us the timing of when this dispute happens. It says, in that hour came the disciples unto Jesus, saying, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And that's in Matthew 18, verse 1. So this dispute followed Peter's lesson in that very same hour, where Jesus, he got the temple tax for Peter, and he said, look, you go and take this and pay for both of us, Peter. And as a result of that, Peter might have thought, hey, the Lord paid my temple tax, so I'm in a much more privileged position than you guys. But also, Remember, 3 of them were up there on Mount Hermon at the Transfiguration also. So Jesus chose 3 out of the 12. So again, we had Peter, James, and John up there, and they might have felt a little bit privileged as well because, hey, the other 9 didn't see what we saw. And now what we have is the disciples are now debating amongst themselves, about their present status. I mean, well, which of us is the greatest? Us 3 or Peter, or, who's the greatest? And they still believed, remember, they're debating who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And so they still believe that Jesus was going to establish his kingdom very shortly. And they're debating, well, who's going to be the top dog next to Jesus? And this dispute happened along the way. And what we have here is they now enter into the house, and Jesus asked him, he says, what were you guys disputing about on the way? We said in Mark 9, verse 33. He knew, but he wants to drive his point home here. And the point here, there's a problem here, and that is the superiority felt amongst this apostolic group. They're a bit puffed up. And so what we see here now is, Jesus is sitting down, and he called to him a little child and set him in the midst of them and said, verily I say unto you, except you turn and become as little children, you shall in no wise enter into the kingdom of heaven. We see this in Matthew 18, 2-3. So what's the lesson first up? The lesson is that they had to be as children with a very childlike faith in order to enter the kingdom. Children are very dependent upon their fathers, and so believers must demonstrate a very childlike dependence on their heavenly Father. Now, Matthew tells us also, Matthew says here, whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And we see Matthew writing that in 18, verse 4. Now remember, only faith, only trust in Jesus are required to enter the kingdom. We just have to exercise faith in Jesus for what he's done for us. And a believer's position in the kingdom will now be determined by how he lived out his faith during his lifetime. So what have you done? What have you done with what I've given you virtually? Now, a small child recognizes that, in the home, in Jesus' day, a small child recognizes that in the home, he has no authority. He's in subjection to the will of the Father. And so what Jesus is saying here is that to receive a great position in the kingdom, one must recognize that, like a child, he has no authority of his own and is in subjection to God the Father. And Jesus states now, if any man would be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. We see that from Mark chapter 9, verse 35. Now, so what we see, what Jesus is saying here, listen, he says, if you want a superior place in the kingdom, don't struggle in this life to achieve the highest position. He says, don't aim for the top. He says, aim for the bottom, aim for the lowest, while ministering to all the people, while serving. Don't strive to be the leader, strive to be the best servant. To become a master in the kingdom, one must be a servant now. And Luke added for that, he says, for he that is least among you all, the same is great. That's Luke 9:48. So greatness in the kingdom is attained by means of childlike humility here on earth. Children, there's a bit of a summary here. Children have no concern for status within the home, for they know who rules the house. They know the parents rule the house, and there's no social status debate going on between the child and the parents. This is very much in Jesus's day, okay? It's a bit different today, but in Jesus's day, that's the context. Secondly, likewise, it is necessary to turn with childlike faith and humility. It is a necessity to turn and repent like a little child, and this is what brings salvation. This is what qualifies a person to enter into the kingdom. And third, this should actually result in a humble spirit. It should result in a humble spirit, because it's nothing on our part which got us into the kingdom. And there should be a spirit of receptiveness of the unimportant or the insignificant. That's being willing to receive a little child. And that's the point of Matthew verse 5. It says, and whoso shall receive one such little child in my name receives me. And fifth, the child we see here is dependent on the Father. So we must be like children and be dependent on God the Father. The sixth thing is the means of attaining greatness in the kingdom involves two things. First of all, it involves becoming least. And second, it involves becoming a servant, becoming like a child. Okay. And here we are. This now wraps up with the other one, exclusiveness and pride. We see this in Matthew 18:6-14 and Mark 9:38-50, Luke 9:49-50. So previous lesson is to be childlike, and this lesson now is to receive those who are childlike. So, Jesus rebukes them, and the apostles, they like being rebuked by the master, so they try and change the subject to to the problem of status. Okay, previously it was a status within the apostolic group, but now it is a status of the apostles against non-apostles, against those who are not apostles. And John, the apostle John, described the circumstances, saying, Master, we saw one casting out demons in your name, and we forbade him because he followed not with us. And we find it in Luke 9, verse 48. And this is a clear expression of exclusiveness, because when the disciples said, because he followed not with us, he did not mean that the man in question was not a follower of Jesus, but he says, hey, he's not one of us 12, right? He's not part of this group of 12, this very special group of 12 that you chose, Jesus. Therefore, they felt superior, and they felt pretty exclusive in regard to exorcising demons. It's for us alone, because we're one of the 12. Other followers of Jesus should not have that same authority or privilege that we have. Now again, Jesus rebuked them, and he says, forbid him not. For he that is not against you is for you. And that's Luke 9:50. And Mark's account is a little bit more elaborate. He says, forbid him not, for there is no man who shall do a mighty work in my name and be able quickly to speak evil of me. For he that is not against us is for us. And that's Mark 9:39-40. Now, Jesus, he taught that a person could accomplish great things for him without belonging to this inner circle of apostles. And Jesus taught them a lesson, he teaches them a lesson on exclusiveness and pride. For whosoever shall give you a cup of water to drink because you are Messiahs, verily I say unto you, he shall in no wise lose his reward. And that's in Mark 9:41. So what Jesus is saying here is that even the most simple of work of a disciple of Jesus, like, giving a cup of cold water to somebody, is going to be rewarded. Something as simple as that. And then Jesus warned them. He says, listen, whosoever shall cause one of these little ones that believe in me to stumble, it were better for him if a great millstone were hanged about his neck and he were cast into the sea. That's in Mark 9:42. The apostles had offended the man that they stopped, that they forbade from casting out demons, right? So they had actually caused him to stumble. And what we see here is Jesus is saying is that all causes of stumbling are going to be justly punished, especially against those children who believe. Another warning followed. Woe unto the world because of occasions of stumbling, for it must needs be that the occasions come, but woe to that man through whom the occasion comes. And we see this in Matthew 18, verse 7. So unbelievers who unbelievers who cause little children to stumble, and there are going to be always people who will do that, will someday be judged. And believers must also take great care not to cause unnecessary stumbling. When we speak about stumbling, it means causing somebody to sin. And Jesus added, and if your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and cast it from you. This is Matthew 18, verse 8. All matters of stumbling should be put away. Even members intended for useful work may at times be need to put away to avoid a greater loss. Now, listen, Jesus is not telling us here to chop off your hand or chop off your foot. That's not what he's saying. Although some people have done that in church history, some people have mutilated themselves. The issue here is not about self-mutilation. It's what Jesus is saying here is one needs to deal with the root cause of the problem. All right, whatever causes a person to stumble or causes others to stumble must be put away. And in the case of the unbeliever, he'll be cast into the unquenchable fire and cast into hell. And we see that in Mark 9:43-44. Matthew actually called it the eternal fire. That's the unquenchable fire. And unbelievers who cause the stumbling of believers, especially believing children, will suffer greater judgment in the lake of fire. It says, where their worm dies not and the fire is not quenched. That's Mark 9:48. And believers, on the other hand, will not end up in the lake of fire because that's not our eternal home. However, we will suffer a greater discipline in this life, and we will suffer loss of rewards in the next if we cause others to stumble. And Jesus added here, I forgot that I'd made this PowerPoint. Okay, so what we see here is that after explaining the severity of the offense here, Jesus now applied his teaching to the disciples. He says, see that you despise not one of these little ones, for I say unto you that in heaven their angels do always behold the face of my Father who is in heaven. And we see that in Matthew 18, verse 10. So what does that teach us? That teaches us that all children have a guardian angel who report how people cause them to stumble. And Matthew mentioned here the Father's underlying principle. Even so, it is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. That's Matthew 18, verse 14. Again, the emphasis here is on children, and both believers and unbelievers will suffer greater punishment if they cause one of these children to stumble. And Jesus now adds the principle of salt. For everyone shall be salted with fire. Salt is good. But if salt have lost its saltiness, wherewith will ye season it? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace one with another. And that's found in Mark 9:49-50. So Jesus makes 2 points in these verses. First of all, he mentioned the judgment all believers will undergo. And we see this in several New Testament passages. We see this in Romans 14:10-12 and 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10. He says here that their works will be tested or will be salted with fire, and that's at the judgment seat of the Messiah, meaning their works will be tested by fire. And you see that in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 12-15. So while your good deeds will be purified, just like here you purify precious metals by fire, you melt it, get all the impurities out of it. The bad deeds are going to be burnt up like wood, hay, and stubble. Jesus' second point now pertains to the positive attributes of salt. Now, in its Talmudic usage, the phrase "salt is good." But if the salt has lost its saltiness, wherewith will you season it? That is an expression of the impossible. That's how it's used in the Talmud. But in Judaism, salt was added to every sacrifice to symbolize the incorruptible, the higher, and the acuteness of the intellect. That's why they salted the sacrifices. Salt was compared to the soul and to the scripture, and it was a symbol of God's covenant relationship with the nation of Israel. And the Talmud teaches that the world cannot survive without salt. And salt was a necessity of life in the ancient world. Why? Because remember, salt was used to preserve food. Now, salt generally does not lose its saltiness. And so people say, well, you know, how can you say if the salt loses its saltiness? Well, in actual fact, the salt used for the sacrifices at the Second Temple was taken from the Dead Sea. And salt from the Dead Sea can actually lose its savory quality, and it actually becomes insipid. So the Dead Sea salt can lose its saltiness. Now, what's the application here? The application is this. Salt typifies that quality which is the mark of a disciple. It's a distinctive mark of a disciple. The loss, if you lose that saltiness, you're going to become useless to the Lord. You remember, salt brings flavor and it brings preservation. And so the disciples here were being encouraged to retain their salt-like quality and to be at peace among themselves. Stop arguing about who's going to be the greatest. And when Jesus says, have salt in yourselves, we find, which you see in Mark 9, verse 50, he meant that they should attract others by their saltiness, being at peace with and showing love for one another. Remember, salt also causes thirst. So their saltiness should make others thirst for what they have, namely water of life. Now, we have instruction concerning forgiveness here, almost done. Matthew 18, verse 15 to 35. And this is this is actually the second time that we see the church being mentioned in the gospel. The first time was back in Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. Now in chapter 18, we see the church mentioned again. But here it refers to the local church because we're now dealing with a church discipline. Now, Jesus now moves from a discussion on causing offense, right, to another brother, to a discussion on how the church is to proceed when an offense has occurred. And so what we see here is that church discipline should follow four steps, four clearly defined steps here. First of all, this is in Matthew 18:15. If your brother sins against you, go show him his fault between you and him alone. If he hear you, you have gained your brother. So what we see here is that if I've been offended, the offended brother, I need to approach the one who offended me one-on-one, privately, and to point out, you know, your sin, you offended me. Okay. Talking with anyone else in advance violates this principle. This passage here, now also this passage is not talking about moral sins, as in the case of 1 Corinthians 5, 1-5, in that passage, it says someone has his father's wife, where Paul tells the elders to immediately remove the immoral member from the congregation. This passage here addresses a personal issue where you know, one member has offended another member. Okay. The second thing here is that if the offender doesn't respond to that individual, he must once again be confronted, this time by one or two additional people. And why one or two? Well, because the principle here is that at the mouth of two or three, every word may be established. So you need witnesses. This is Matthew 18, verse 16. So if the offender now responds positively to this confrontation, then fellowship is now restored. Third procedure, if the offender still fails to respond, tell it onto the church. Tell it to everybody in the congregation. And we see this in Matthew 18, verse 17. And then fourth, if after having been admonished by the brethren, he still refuses to repent, the principle is, let him be unto you as the Gentile and the publican. And we see this in Matthew 18, verse 17. In the Jewish context, this means the person is now untouchable. He is excommunicated and banned from the fellowship. Now, excommunication means that the sinning brother is now placed back under Satan's authority for the destruction of the flesh, not his spirit. So his salvation is not affected. And we see that principle worked out in 1 Corinthians 5, verses 1 to 5. That's exactly what Paul did. Normally, Satan has no authority over the death of a believer. It is Jesus who puts to sleep the believer. And you can check that out in 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 13 to 15. But the one exception to this rule is in the case of an excommunicated believer. Satan has the authority to put that believer to death. He can choose the moment of the believer's passing, but his authority is only ever physical. It is not to do with the spiritual life. If any man see his, if you look at 1 John 5:16, if any man see his brother sinning a sin not unto death, he shall ask, and God will give him life for them that sin not unto death. There is a sin unto death. Not concerning this do I say that he should make request. So the believer who has committed the sin unto death is facing physical extinction because he was excommunicated. And for such a person, intercessory prayer now ceases. He's not only outside the fellowship of the local church, but he's also now outside the prayers of the saints. There is no communication at all with this excommunicated brother. And then we see here that it continues on here with the next 3 verses, continuation of the teaching on church discipline. Again, they're quite often taken in a context. In Matthew 18, verse 18, Jesus says, verily I say unto you, what things soever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and what things soever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Remember the terms binding and loosing. We did that. We studied that last session. It was stated that they were used legislatively, judicially. Legislatively, to bind means to forbid, to loose means to allow. Judicially, to bind means to punish, to loose means not to punish. Now, this authority was given to the apostles alone, and they kept it until the end of their lives. Now, the church has also the authority to bind and loose in a judicial sense, but not the same degree as the apostles. For instance, the apostles could actually issue a death sentence. We saw that with Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5. The church can bind and loose to the point of breaking or not breaking fellowship with a sinning believer. It can excommunicate or not excommunicate. If you notice here, there's nothing here about Satan, is there? Nothing at all. So this does not refer to binding Satan or his demons, right? The context here is church discipline, not spiritual warfare. And Jesus continued, he said, again, I say unto you that if 2 of you shall agree on earth as touching anything that they shall ask, it shall be done for them of my Father who is in heaven. Okay, again, people take this out of context and use it as a prayer promise that, if two or three believers agree on anything on earth, then, we ask the Father and it's going to be granted. But it's not to do with prayer, right? It's not to do with prayer. Again, it's church discipline, right? The 2 people who agree are the witnesses who confront the brother with his sin and who witness to the local church that the sinning brother had not responded properly. Therefore, the actions of the church are based upon the testimony of the 2 witnesses. They tell the church what's going on, and in turn, the decision of the church is now recognized by heaven, and heaven allows Satan to take that believer's life. And Jesus now ends here. He says, for where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. Matthew 18, verse 20. Again, this is often taken out of context, and this is understood to mean that this gathering of believers is a local church. Nothing like that. 2 or 3 believers gathered together does not define the local church. In the New Testament, a local church is an organized body under the authority of elders and deacons. It's a structured body with a chain of authority. The verse needs to be viewed in the context here of church discipline. The 2 or 3, again, are the witnesses who testify to the church that the sinning brother has not repented. All right? And if their testimony is valid, then Jesus is among them, authenticating their decision or their deposition. And since Jesus is now authenticating their statement, heaven removes the protection from the sinning brother, who can then be put to death by Satan. If you go back to paragraph 84, this helps a bit of explanation. Okay, now, almost finished. Peter now raises a question. Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Until 7 times? Matthew 18:21. Well, compared to the Pharisees, the apostles, Peter was being very generous. Why? Because oral law, oral tradition, Mishnaic tradition, Pharisaic law, a person was only bound to forgive 3 times. And after that, he wasn't obligated to forgive anymore. 3 times and you're out. 3 strikes, you're out. Peter doubled that and he added 1 more. Jesus says, I say not unto you until 7 times 7, but until 70 times 7. Jesus' use of this figure of speech did not mean that we need to forgive exactly 490 times. We don't count them off. Remember, in the scriptures, the number 7 emphasizes a completeness, right? Totality, perfection. So Jesus' statement implies unlimited forgiveness. Keep on forgiving. As often as a brother asks, just as often he is to be forgiven. In fact, if you start counting offenses, right, it only shows external, not internal forgiveness. Because if you start to count them, I'm not really forgiving you. Now, to drive home the point a little bit more, Jesus told the parable of an unmerciful servant, and in this parable, what happens was that the king forgave a servant a massive amount of money. However, the servant was unwilling to forgive someone else who owed him only a pittance. He even had the debtor thrown into prison. And when the king found out about it, he punished that wicked servant. Okay, what does this parable teach us? It teaches us 3 things. First of all, having received forgiveness from God, we should develop a forgiving spirit. Why? Because we should realize that we have been forgiven much, and it should make us very willing to forgive much as well. Now, obviously, we cannot extend forgiveness onto the other person. Ask for it. If I've offended somebody, and I mightn't even know, so the person has to ask me for forgiveness. Now, the willingness to forgive should always be there. Second, God's children should imitate their father's forgiveness. Third, an unforgiving person cannot and should not expect to be forgiven. Now, this is Matthew 18:35. Listen what Jesus says. So shall also my heavenly Father do unto you, if you forgive not everyone his brother from your hearts. Now, this is not speaking about salvation forgiveness. That was already taken care of at the cross. But this has to do with family forgiveness, fellowship forgiveness. We're part of the family. We can't have any tensions within the family. So this is family and fellowship forgiveness. We still sin. We all still sin. And when we confess our sins, what happens is we receive family forgiveness from God, and the tension's gone. But if a person is unwilling to forgive a brother who has sinned against him, then, he has no basis for seeking forgiveness from God for his own sins. God will withhold this family forgiveness from an unforgiving believer. And we finally finished. Okay. Thank you for coming along.